So today we're celebrating Dharma Day. The actual day was the full moon, which was a few days ago. In the Indian calendar, it's the moons that mark the months, and most of our festivals take place on a full moon day. And I'd like to briefly take you back to the last festival we had, which was Buddha Day. So that was the full moon on which the Buddha gained enlightenment all those centuries and even millennia ago. So we don't know exactly when that happened. Early Indian history is very obscure. People have tried to work out when the Buddha lived, and there are various different dates depending on different permutations. Probably it doesn't really matter. He probably gained enlightenment about 400 or 500 BCE. It's a long time ago. But I want to take us back to that period in ancient India. So the Buddha, after gaining enlightenment, and you might have heard something of this at our last festival if you attended that, he sat under different trees after the initial enlightenment experience, absorbing and perhaps expanding his enlightenment experience. And he did that for 7 weeks, apparently. And at the end of that period, he felt ready to teach. And he thought about who to teach. Initially, he thought of a couple of people who had been his teachers. He'd left them because they couldn't show him the whole way to enlightenment, but nevertheless he respected their sincerity and the depth of their practice. So he thought of going to tell them about enlightenment. But then he realized that they had died. So the next set of people that he thought of were the people that he practiced austerities with. 5, we might call them monks. They were fellow wanderers who lived a celibate life wandering around northern India. And they'd all practiced together, although it was clear that the Buddha had practiced harder, more deeply than the other 5. Nevertheless, when the Buddha decided that giving up eating, practicing these hard austerities was leading him nowhere except to an early death, and left to take ordinary food and prepare himself for meditation, the others were disgusted. They thought he'd given up the spiritual life, and they swore to have nothing more to do with him. But the Buddha thought of them, and he realized that they might be receptive. Perhaps he could make them receptive to his experience. So he walked from Bodh Gaya to Sarnath. Bodh Gaya is on the edge of Gaya in northern India, and Sarnath is on the edge of Varanasi, also in northern India, but they're quite some way apart. So it took the Buddha a while to get there. And when he did, these 5 were living in a deer park. This is the way these kind of ascetic wanderers lived. They found a place, perhaps a pleasure garden, that was owned by some nobleman, and they asked permission just to stay there for a while. As the Buddha came up to them, they said to each other, "Look, here he comes. That guy who did all the backsliding, fancy him eating proper food. We just won't talk to him. We just ignore him." But as the Buddha got closer, there was something about him that made it impossible for them to ignore him, impossible for them to blank him. And they rose to their feet and they saluted him. And when the Buddha began to talk, he said, you may find this hard to believe, but I've reached the end of the path. I've reached the goal. I've gained enlightenment. And they said, oh, come on. You know, we saw you eating that food. You can't possibly have gained enlightenment. He said, no, when I lived with you, did I ever claim to have gained enlightenment? They said, no. He said, so why would I say that now? So that really struck them. So they thought, okay, let's give him a chance. And actually what happened is they went into retreat. This is the time of year in India when the monsoon season begins and it becomes impossible to move around. So people, including wanderers, stay in one place for that period of time. So they went into retreat, and one of them would go and get food from the village and bring it back for all 5 of them. And it's said that by the end of the rainy season retreat, one of the 5 had got it, and the Buddha said, Kondinya has also gained enlightenment. So that was the first teaching, the teaching of the Buddha in the deer park, and it was far from his last teaching. When all 5 of those monks had got it, the Buddha, at the end of the retreat, met a young man called Yasa, who was sort of hurrying through the woods, fleeing from something. And they had a talk, they had a communication, as a result of which, just from that communication, this young man wasn't even a wanderer. He was a young layman. He also gained enlightenment. He became what's called an arahant. He had the same freedom from all the mental hindrances that the Buddha had. And Yasa was so enthusiastic, he went and got all his friends, and they came and they listened to the Buddha and they gained enlightenment. So very soon, it's said that there were 60 arahants. And that was a good beginning, but it was far from the end of the Buddha's life. It was the beginning of his life as a Dharma teacher. And very soon, there were other people who gained enlightenment under the Buddha. And one of them is quite an interesting case. He became effectively one of the Buddha's main disciples. His name was Sariputta. Actually, there were 2 friends, Sariputta and Moggallana. But they had agreed that if one of them gained enlightenment, they would immediately go and find the other and tell him how it had happened. So they had a close bond. And Sariputta was wandering on the road, and he met one of these first disciples of the Buddha, one of the 5 who'd been practicing in the deer park with the Buddha. And he asked him, who's your teacher? What's their teaching? Apparently this was quite normal practice, that when wanderers met, that was the kind of conversation they had. And Assaji said, the Buddha's my teacher, and what he teaches is that everything has a cause, and all causes can come to an end. And Sariputta was absolutely gobsmacked. On the spot, he became what we call a stream entrant. It's a little bit short of enlightenment, but it's a spark. It's like the bulb goes off in your head. You catch a glimpse of what reality is all about. And of course, he went and got his friend Moggallana, and together they went to see the Buddha, and in a very short time, they became arahant, enlightened disciples of the Buddha. So a lot of people, under the impact of the Buddha in his life, seemed to become enlightened very, very quickly. Sometimes as a result of just a single talk, a single meeting. Sometimes as a result of practicing in that early Sangha for a rainy season retreat or something like that. So in the beginning, people seemed to learn very quickly, or at least some of them did. But it seems that even in the Buddha's life, that might not have continued. So we can't take these early Buddhist texts as literal history, but nevertheless, there's something historical embedded in them. In other words, they were written down at a certain point in time, and they certainly contain the thoughts and feelings that people had at that point in time when they were written down, even though that might not be exactly the same time as the Buddha's life. And even though those thoughts and feelings may have developed even after the Buddha's death, but they're very early. So in the Pali Canon, this early set compendium of Buddhist texts, there's one point where people ask the question, why is it that at the beginning of the Buddha's life, there were many arahants and few rules? But now, there are few arahants and many rules. So you can see where they were going with this. They were trying to make that connection. They obviously felt that something had happened, that at the beginning of the Buddha's career of teaching, so many people got enlightened so quickly, but somehow that seems to have tailed off, whether that was actually during the Buddha's life, or whether this is someone reflecting after the Buddha's death. They're trying to understand, why is that? Why is it that it seems harder now to gain enlightenment? And they're kind of blaming the rules, but we're not going to go there. I take it that is in a way just a thought. They're trying to make a connection. So they're thinking, okay, we did have many arahants very quickly, and at that time there really weren't any rules. Now there are fewer arahants. Oh, we have more rules as well, so maybe there's a connection. But in one way or another, people were definitely beginning to ask, either in the Buddha's life or quite soon afterwards, why? What was going on? How did some of these people gain enlightenment just with one meeting with the Buddha, and other people didn't? So obviously the Buddha's impact as an enlightened teacher was huge. We can't probably even imagine what it's like to meet the Buddha. But nevertheless, the Buddha met a lot of people, and they didn't all get enlightened. So he was wandering around northern India for 45 years, we're told, after his enlightenment. And he was begging his food. He was going from village to village. Every village he would have had some conversation with some people. Maybe people came after he'd eaten and he gave a teaching underneath a tree. I've been to India. I know what it's like. If you go to village India, not much happens, right? And you have to imagine now a time before phones, before computers, before TV, before radio. Even less happened in an Indian village. So even now, if you turn up at an Indian village and as a stranger and give a talk, the whole village will turn out. I mean, they don't know who you are, but it's better than just sitting at home doing nothing, isn't it? So you can imagine the Buddha must have met and talked to hundreds, thousands, maybe tens of thousands of people, some of whom instantly got it, and some of whom didn't. We know from the text that there was a sort of variety of responses. So some people, on hearing a talk from the Buddha, either gained enlightenment or at least stream entry, at least the light shone for a moment before their mind closed down again. Other people, it was a bit less than that, but they went for refuge to the Buddha. They acknowledged that the Buddha had really got something, and they wanted to practice his teaching, and they maybe learnt enough to carry on practicing when he'd moved on. But other people just turned away, said, yeah, okay, so what? And we have an account of that very, very early in the Buddha's life, when he was walking to Sarnath to give his first teaching. On the road, he met another wanderer. And the wanderer was very impressed with him. He could see he was sort of radiant, he was pure. So he said to him, wow, what are you? Are you a god? Are you some kind of divinity? And the Buddha said, no. He said, oh, are you human? And the Buddha said, no. So he said, well, what are you? And he said, I'm a Buddha. one who is awake? And the guy went, maybe, and went off on his way. Yeah? So there were lots of maybes as well. There were lots of people who must have met the Buddha, even heard the Buddha, and just thought, yeah, well, maybe. So people asked themselves, why was this? Why did some people meet the Buddha and have such a strong experience, even an enlightened one, and other people just walked away apparently untransformed? So, that we have the rules idea, but perhaps there were other thoughts that people had. And go back to my notes. Yes, so one thought that people had was that maybe it was a result of group reincarnation. Now, this probably sounds quite far-fetched to most of you, okay? Some of you will not believe in the idea of rebirth. Some of you will think that we only have this life. Now, we know that in many parts of the world, it's sort of taken for granted that people have lives before this life. And there is actually quite a lot of evidence building up in the West. There's a lot of interest in the possibility, and quite a lot of studies of various kinds have been done, often following through stories where parents have been astonished that their child will tell them something like, I want to see my old house, I want to see my other parents, or something like that. And I have seen one of these, I remember years ago on TV, a little Indian boy, again, quite simple background in a village, who kept saying to his parents that he was actually from the nearest town. So eventually they had reason to go to the town, and he went with them, and he insisted that they follow him, and he found a shop, a particular shop. He went in, there was a woman behind the counter in the small shop, and he addressed her by her name. He started telling her all sorts of things about her life, and he said he was her former husband. He was a little boy like this, right? And apparently there'd been some kind of quarrel, a violent quarrel, and he'd been shot dead. It had a premature death. So the woman herself was perhaps, not elderly, maybe only in her 40s or 50s. And it was a really interesting story. So for those of you that have your doubts, keep your doubts, they're yours. But there is actually quite a lot of evidence. You can now look at online YouTube videos, that sort of thing, for the idea of rebirth. But what about group reincarnation? That even seems quite strange, doesn't it? But I remember I got very interested, Sangharakshita got very interested in the Cathars. You may never have heard of the Cathars, but they were a sort of heretic sect of Christianity in southern France, in the Languedoc. And they considered themselves the true Christians, but their beliefs were quite antithetical to Orthodox Christianity. And eventually they were hunted down and persecuted by the Inquisition and wiped out. But there was a man, a doctor, he would be dead now, but he'd written a book called The Cathars and Reincarnation. And he believed that he had been a Cathar, and that a number of people that he'd been a Cathar with in 13th century southern France had reincarnated as a group on a number of occasions, always forming a sort of incipient spiritual community once they'd met each other again. And he gives quite a strong account of how in this life, he was a scientist, he was a doctor, he didn't believe in those sort of things, he wasn't even spiritually minded, he thought, but he started getting these incredibly strong migraines. And as a result of that, he kind of went towards, naturopathy and things more spiritual to try and cure himself. And they got a bit better, but they only disappeared when he found the other people in his group and when he was, as it were, back on the spiritual path. So it was a very interesting book. Now, the early Buddhists seem to have believed that the Buddha reincarnated with a group of people, many of whom in his last life were his relatives. So his wife Yashodhara is said to have been married to the Buddha many, many times before. His cousins Devadatta, Ananda, Nanda, they had all had lives with the Buddha before. So in this way, people thought, well, perhaps that's why these people made progress so quickly, because they've had many lives practicing with the Buddha. But it's a very incomplete explanation, because even those early Buddhists knew that this was only a handful of people and that there were many others who'd had this very strong impact from the Buddhist teaching. So we can continue with early Buddhism's question of how does this work? What's going on? Of course, we don't know. You may not be aware of this, but you actually know hardly anything. So just keep an open mind. I was watching some things on YouTube about modern scientific ideas about the universe. Black holes, dark matter, is the universe expanding, Big Bang, all that kind of thing. And then I was listening to one that was bringing in new evidence which showed that all these previous ideas didn't work. And I had a sort of aha moment. I just thought, they don't know, do they? I'm listening to these people who apparently know so much more than me. I know nothing about these things. But actually, when it comes down to it, they're all theories. They don't know. And we're all in that position. We really know very, very little. We hear a lot, we trust a lot, but the things that we know for sure are few and far between. So just keep an open mind to how these early Buddhists thought. So there was a period when they started thinking about the Buddha's previous lives. So obviously they thought, well, maybe some of these people are rebirthing with him time and again, but not everybody. And then they started thinking, well, hang on, how did the Buddha get here? How did the Buddha get enlightened? And they saw that the Buddha had had so many lives in which he practiced the Dharma. Obviously not as successfully as his final life, but when he practiced one or other aspect of the Dharma, he'd practiced generosity, he'd practiced ethics, he'd practiced energy in pursuit of the good, he'd practiced meditation, he'd practiced mindfulness. And these lives were innumerable, but kind of tracking back, they realized that it all started with a single act. Inconceivably long ago, far, far away from our present time and place, the Buddha that we know had met another Buddha. He'd met a Buddha called Dipankara. And when he met Dipankara Buddha, he didn't know anything about Buddhism. But again, he was very impressed by Dipankara. And the story is that he not only bowed to Dipankara, but that he put his long hair in a puddle so that Dipankara could walk over it without getting his feet dirty. So what people saw was that one act put him on the path to enlightenment. Even though it took all those lives, even though it took so much practice, It was that act, it was the act of responding to a Buddha that put him on the path. And there's a whole early Buddhist tradition. In Pali it's called the Upadana. In Sanskrit there's a similar set of texts called the Avadana, which shows how individual Buddhist characters got on the path. I'm just going to tell you about one, because you might have heard of this person. So who's heard of the Emperor Ashoka? Yeah, quite a lot. So Ashoka was a sort of pro-Buddhist, in fact he was a Buddhist, emperor of India, and he's left a lot of inscriptions on pillars and stones around India, so we know quite a bit about his thinking. And he encouraged everyone to try and practice a form of the Dharma, not as Buddhists, but just to encouraging people to lead ethical lives, to refrain from killing, even from refrain from killing animals and so on. So he's a very unusual figure for politics. But anyway, he has an Avadana. There is an Ashoka Avadana. And in the story, Ashoka's in a previous life at the time of the historical Buddha, the Buddha that we know. And he's just a little boy. And he's playing by the roadside. I told you there's not much going on in Indian villages, so it's not like he was playing with his Xbox. He was playing with some mud. And as the Buddha walked by, he was very moved. So people were offering the Buddha food. Ashoka made a mud pie and took that over to the Buddha and very reverently offered the Buddha a mud pie. Now it's very interesting because in Buddhism it's really intention that counts. Action comes out of intention. And so the fact that this was a child who acted something out in imagination effectively is considered every bit as powerful as if he'd given the Buddha a crown of jewels or something like that. So his intention was so strong that that was the cause of him being reborn, according to his Abhidharma, as the Emperor Ashoka, so that he could practice Buddhism and spread Buddhism. Now, he's a long way short of enlightenment still, but it just gives you some idea of the kind of thinking that was going on. And I find this very interesting. I've read a very good article by an American scholar about this literature, the Avadana literature, and matching it up to the early Buddhist world, which I've studied in its material remains, and particularly to the stupa. Now, the stupa is effectively a burial mound, but it becomes quite grand. And according to this scholar, what was happening was that in the absence of the Buddha himself, the Buddha's relics were interred all over India in these stupas. And people felt, okay, I can't offer my mud pie to the Buddha, as it were, but I can make an offering to the relics of the Buddha. As it were, the presence of the Buddha is still among us. And according to this scholar, this was done at great festivals. Now, here we are, we're at a festival, but we're all rather quiet. In fact, we even had a silent tea break. But sometimes on the outside of these stupas, you see what an Indian festival really looked like. So in one of them, there's a picture of people with drums, quite big drums, you know, the sort you hang around your neck and you beat from both sides. And someone else has got flute. It looks like panpipes or something like that. And they're clearly making a lot of noise. And this is one of the sculptures on the outside of the stupa. And the whole of the stupa, this is at Sanchi, is covered in sculptures of people. Sometimes it's incidents from the Buddha's life, but often it's sort of generic. People are dancing around a Bodhi tree. They're making offerings to a throne, to a stupa. And they're clearly having a great time. They're really enjoying themselves. And according to this article, the basis for that is this idea that by responding to the Buddha in this way, effectively they're putting themselves on the path to enlightenment. So what's not to like? You know, all of you who've come here today are in the same position. You might be a bit quieter, but you've come here in response to the Buddha Dharma. You've come here because you care about the path, about the teachings, because you want to practice them. And according to the sort of broad Buddhist tradition, that itself has a very positive, it has a very tonic effect. As you begin to purify yourself and purify your, what Buddhism would call karma, it can only lead to future benefit of some kind or another. So this was their thinking, that, well, if I just make a start, then I'll have a good experience in this life. If there is such a thing as rebirth, I'm setting myself up for the best possible rebirth, whatever that is. At least it'll be better than if I did all the things I used to do. And this was their thinking. So, as well as the people who actually offered things to the stupa, and the festival would have included the offering of the sculptures, the pillars, the gateways that surround the stupa, all organized on a grand scale. The sculpture itself depicts some really interesting things. Now, Sanchi is one of my favorite places. The sculpture is beautiful. And I've been there several times. And around the stupa, there's a railing with 4 gateways. They're kind of open gateways. And they're covered in sculpture. They're covered in decorations, you might say. But those decorations are meaningful, and there's a huge amount of plant life. There are innumerable lotus roundels, flowers. There are vines creeping up, working their way round the pillars and the sculptures and the panels. And there's a lot of animal life. And very often the animals are shown responding to the Buddha in the form of a Bodhi tree or a stupa. So I can remember a panel where there are a whole herd of elephants offering lotuses, and the lotuses have still got the long stems, so the elephants plucked it from a pond with its trunk, and they're all offering those to a Bodhi tree or a stupa. In another panel, there are all kinds of animals sort of surrounding the image of the Buddha as a stupa or a Bodhi tree, because he wasn't depicted as a human being as such. So I was very struck by this. I mean, they're also human beings and all sorts of gods and divinities gathering around the Buddha, making offerings to the Buddha, bowing to the Buddha, circumambulating the Buddha. It's as if all life is there. We've lost something of this in our religious life. Sangharakshita once said, if we wanted to become true Buddhists, perhaps we needed to be pagans first. So what you get at a place like Sanchi is a sense that Buddhism comes in on top of that kind of animism. That it doesn't destroy it, it doesn't disparage it. And it sees all of life coming to its fulfillment in enlightenment. And I don't think I'm just being, I don't think I'm making it up. I interpret the imagery in that way. But interesting, Sangharakshita, when he was talking about going for refuge, he talked about it in a number of different ways. So he said there's an ethnic going for refuge, like you find where people just take the precepts in a Buddhist country, but they don't do much about it. There's a provisional going for refuge, where we do respond to the Dharma, to the teachings, and we do try and practice them, but it's still a bit haphazard. We have days on and quite a few days off, as it were. And then there's effective going for refuge, which he equated with our ordination, when someone has reached a depth in their practice, a pitch of intensity, where they are able to effectively go for refuge, at least in the context of the Sangha. There's no guarantee that you won't fall back, but at least while you're coming to the centre, while you're spending your time with other like-minded people, your practice will be sustained because you really want that to happen. And then he had real going for refuge, which is that point that I mentioned people having in relation to the Buddha and his teaching, where a light goes on in your head, at least for a moment, and you cannot forget that. You know that that is the way things really are. And it kind of cuts. William Blake, who was actually an etcher by profession, said that spiritual realization was like acid on an etching plate. Once it's dropped on, it just works its way in. You don't have to do anything more. So that spiritual realization is like that. It may still take a long time. You may have your ups and downs, but something is kind of cutting deeper and deeper into your understanding. But Sangharakshita also said, a bit hesitantly, that he felt, he couldn't prove it, but he felt that there was, as it were, a cosmic element to going for refuge. And I think this is what he meant. I think what he meant was it sometimes seems as if all life is leading towards enlightenment. And he had this idea of what he called the lower and higher evolution. So the lower evolution is how we got to this point. It's that infinitely long period of time where we made it from an amoeba to a potentially self-aware human being. And that was a process of life itself that took us to this point. But the higher evolution, he said, we had to act as potentially aware human beings. We needed to do something to become aware and to use that awareness to practice the Buddha's teachings if we wanted to gain enlightenment. And again, I think that is kind of upheld by the imagery of Indian Buddhism. All Buddhas and Bodhisattvas are pictured on a lotus. They sit on a lotus. The lotus is their support. And again, I think that is the same message. The message is, of course, the lotus grows out of, it's usually said, the mud. I've seen lotuses in India. They grow out of the vilest, stagnant puddles, covered in slime. So you get this beautiful, pure lotus growing out of the slime. So again, the image seems to be saying that out of the slime, life sort of arises, reaches a pitch of intensity, and on that basis, enlightenment is possible. Enlightenment rests on that lower evolution, as it were. It can't take place without it. So there's that saying in Far Eastern Buddhism, it's like ice and water. No water, no ice. No beings, no Buddhas. So when we think about this, we think that what's really important, what was really important to those ancient Buddhists, and is still important to us, is getting on the path. Doing something to put yourself on the path towards enlightenment. It's the start that's really important, not the end. Now, admittedly, having started, you need to follow through. And it's quite possible that you might have to have many starts, because often you forget and you get caught up in things and you lose it. But the important thing is that beginning. And according to Buddhism, that is so positive that it doesn't matter what level you reach at that point. By practicing, by following the path, you're doing yourself the most good you possibly can. So we're all in this. Sometimes when we just talk about the first Dharma Day, we have that image of the Buddha and his 5, ascetic, now monastic disciples, sort of sitting in a little huddle for the rainy season retreat. And we might feel, well, I'm not about to give up my life, I'm not about to become a monk. I can't do it like that. But we're all in this. We're all in this monk and lay, to use those traditional terms. Or in terms of Triratna, we're all in this together, order members, mitras, and friends. And in fact, not only are we all in it together, but it's quite hard to know where in it we are. It doesn't matter, of course, but sometimes we ask ourselves, is that person more developed than me? They're an order member, I'm not an order member. Well, they might have been doing it longer than you. They might be effectively going for refuge. But who's to say you haven't reached that point yourself and it just hasn't been recognised? Perhaps it hasn't even been recognised by you. I know asking for ordination is quite a big thing. And I remember when it happened to me. So Karuna Gita said I was ordained in 1977, which is true. But I came along in 1976 and I got involved pretty quickly. I won't go into my background, but I was ready for what I found. And I had one particular person who was the chair of the centre I was going to, who was my kind of main link with the movement, with Sangharakshita, with the Buddha, with the Dharma. And I heard that he was going to go away on a month's solitary retreat, which seemed to me like a very long time. I was only 21. Life seemed, to go past more quickly then. Less quickly. I'd heard that you could formally have Kalyana Mitras, people who kind of kept an eye out for you. And I thought I would ask him to be that for me, along with one other person, one other order member that I knew. So I went to see him and I said, would you do that? And he said, yes, of course I would. But are you thinking of asking for ordination then? Because usually we reserve that for people who are asking for ordination. Well, I'd never thought about asking for ordination. In fact, I didn't even know that I could think about asking for ordination. So I went home to my little place on my own and I was thinking about it and I was puzzling it over. What did it mean and this and that? And suddenly something arose and I had this view, this vision of the path. And I realized, yes, this is what I want. I may only have been coming for a short time, but this is what I want to do with my life. I know that. I've just been, as it were, shy of admitting that. So I went back the next day and I said, well, forget about all that. How do I ask for ordination? And, on I went. So we're all in this together. We are admittedly at different places and points in our spiritual lives. Some of us, no doubt, are more advanced than others. But as Bhante said one of his teachers had said to him, there were 3 Tibetan teachers, all very famous, who were considered, all 3 were considered reincarnations of an even more famous Tibetan teacher. And one of them said to Sangharakshita, actually, one of us is much more developed than the other 2, but you'll never know who that is. Because they were all so developed, it was really hard to tell except for them. So, what does all this mean? Well, I had an interesting experience. I was recently at Adhisthana on retreat, and it was a retreat of order members who are taking responsibility. Some of those were younger order members, and some of them, like me, were rather old in every sense. And we had talks every day as well as meditation, and in one of the talks, one of the younger order members, who's taking quite a lot of responsibility for some particular aspect of the movement, gave a talk, and he was so energetic, so enthusiastic, doing so much. You know, what he was describing was way beyond my elderly capacity. And I thought, oh God, now I really feel old. And then it struck me, and I thought, wow, is this what older order members thought? You know, when I was young and enthusiastic and just ordained and telling everybody, you know, enthusiastically how much I was doing or whatever. And then another person gave a talk, and in their talk, it actually went a bit deeper into sort of, not quite the area I'm talking about, but a relevant area. And it was a challenging talk. It was very much being mirrored with where you are. But what I realized at that point was it was an existentially challenging talk, because probably no one in that room was enlightened. So in a way, we're all in the same position. We're not there yet. We might have started, we might be practicing, but we haven't got there yet. So we're all in this together. We're all practicing to some degree. Some of us have been doing it longer, maybe have more experience, maybe even have more wisdom. But probably no one in this room is at the end of the path yet. So we are all in it together. And in that sense, we can celebrate Dharma Day for all of us. It's a day for everybody. Everybody needs the Dharma. There are a number of Buddhist teachers that have given quite interesting kind of, say, talks, but they're often songs in which they point out that all sorts of different types of people need the Dharma. Men, women, young people, old people, rich people, poor people. We all need the Dharma. We all need to practice the Dharma. And we can all do that together. And it really doesn't matter what level we've reached so far. What really matters is that we start, we continue, and that we get support from our communication with one another. But that really brings us on to Sangha Day, which is still a few months off. So I'll stop there.